They found her earring on the altar 3 days after she disappeared. Not near the water, not on the street. On the altar, sitting inside the brass dish where the offerings go, the one nobody touches, the one the old women said belonged to Yemanja herself. Tayo saw it and didn't call the police. He sat down on the floor of that bar and didn't move for 2 hours. Because he knew whose earring that was. And he knew what it meant that the goddess had taken it. And he knew, God help him, he knew exactly what he had done to deserve this. She didn't come to Salvador looking for love. She came because her mother was dying in Lagos. Her rent in London was 3 months gone. And the only person in the world who still answered her calls at 2 a.m. was a man named Tayo, who lived in Brazil and said, "Come, I have work for you here. Come and breathe. Come before you drown in that gray country." So Chidera packed one bag, sold her winter coat, booked a one-way ticket. She told herself it was temporary. That's what you tell yourself when you're running. You make it sound like a plan. Salvador da Bahia hit her like a fever. The color of it, the noise, the way the sea looked from the upper city, heavy and silver and ancient, like it had been waiting there since before anybody had a name for it. The women in white dresses moving through the Pelourinho like they were carrying prayers inside their bodies. The smell of acreage frying at the corner where her street met the market. The drums that started every evening without warning and didn't stop until something inside you had broken open. She had not expected to feel anything. She had not expected to feel this. Chidera was Igbo, born in Enugu, raised partly in Port Harcourt, finished in London. She understood water. She understood the old things her grandmother whispered about the river. Idemolai, the pillar of water, the mother who wore a python and did not beg to be respected. She had grown up half believing, half dismissing, the way you do when you live between two worlds and trust neither completely. But Salvador was not asking her what she believed. Salvador simply was. Tayo had a bar near the waterfront. A proper place, not a shack, not a hustle. A long wooden room with ceiling fans and good rum and a sound system that respected itself. He called it Olosa, after the Yoruba goddess of the lagoon, which should have told Chidera something from the very first night. He was tall, Tayo, dark in the way that Yoruba men from Ondo can be dark, like the wood of a good tree, like something the earth made slowly and was proud of. He had a scar above his left eyebrow from a fight he never explained. He laughed with his whole chest. He cooked jollof on Sunday mornings and left the pot on the stove for whoever came. She told herself she was just staying until she sorted the money situation. She told herself Tayo was just a friend. She told herself a lot of things in those first weeks that the drumming slowly made impossible to believe. The work he found her was simple at first. She handled his bookings, managed his social pages, translated for the Brazilian suppliers who didn't speak English and the English tourists who didn't speak anything else. She was good at it. She had always been good at making herself useful. It was the thing she'd learned young, when useful was the only kind of love her family knew how to receive. But Tayo paid her properly. He said, "Thank you," and meant it. He noticed when she was tired without her having to perform exhaustion for sympathy. He left a fan running in her room before she came home on hot nights because he'd worked out, without asking, that she slept better with air moving. Small things. Dangerous things. The kind of things that get into the cracks of a woman who has been running on empty for too long. By the 3rd month, she was not sleeping in her own room anymore, and they both pretended this was something that had simply happened, like weather, like the tide, not a choice either of them had made with their whole chest open and their history laid bare. She sent money to Lagos for her mother's medication. Tayo never asked how much. He just made sure there was always enough in the float account with her name on it. She should have known, even then, that a man who gives that quietly is a man who wants something he hasn't named yet. The woman who would destroy everything arrived on a Tuesday. Her name was Flavia. She was Brazilian, Bahian-born, Candomblé raised, with gold at her throat and the kind of beauty that didn't ask for your attention. It simply collected it the way the sea collects light. She had known Tayo for years. That was the first thing he said when he introduced them. Years, he said. Easy. Casual. The way you say it when you want it to mean nothing. Chidera shook Flavia's hand and smiled and felt something cold move through her that she chose not to name. She was good at not naming things. The lying started quietly, the way lying always does. A night Tayo said he was checking on a supplier, but came back smelling like something warmer than rum. A phone that now slept face down. A Sunday when the jollof pot was empty and he was gone before she woke, and the explanation he gave her when he returned had too many details in it. The way a story does when someone has been practicing it in the car. Chidera did not confront him immediately. She was not a woman who moved without information. She had grown up in a household where speaking too soon just gave people time to build a better lie. So she watched. She listened. She kept her face still and her hands busy, and she waited. What she found was worse than she had imagined. It was not just Flavia. Flavia was the current one, yes, but there had been others. 3, that she could count. Women who'd come through the bar, stayed close for a season, then disappeared quietly the way things do when a man manages the exit well. Chidera found out through Celia, the woman who cleaned the bar on Wednesdays, who told her the way older women tell you hard truths, sitting down, hands folded, voice soft, eyes holding yours so you cannot look away and pretend you didn't hear. He does this, Celia said in Portuguese, and Chidera's Portuguese was good enough now to understand every word. He finds a woman who is lonely, who needs something. He gives her just enough to make her stay. And then he finds the next one, and he keeps both. He is not a bad man in every way. But in this way, in this one way, he is not good. Chidera sat with that for 3 days. She didn't cry. She cooked. She cleaned. She smiled at the bar. She sent her mother's medication money on time. She lay beside Tayo at night and felt the specific coldness of a woman who has decided something but has not yet decided when. What she was really doing was grieving. Not just Tayo. She had enough sense left to know Tayo was not the whole of it. She was grieving the version of herself that had believed. After everything, after London and the failed relationship before that, after her father's abandonment, after all of it, that this time the warmth was real. That she had finally found a place and a person where she could put the bag down. She had put the bag down. She just hadn't checked what was underneath the floor. The confrontation happened on a Thursday night when the bar was closed and the sea was loud, and Flavia made the mistake of coming to the back door. Chidera opened it. The two women looked at each other. Flavia was not cruel. That was the thing that made it harder. She looked at Chidera with something close to recognition, the look of a woman who has also been on the other side of this door before, and she said, quietly, in Portuguese, "You didn't know." It was not a question. "No," Chidera said. "I didn't know." Flavia nodded slowly. "She didn't come inside." She said, "Neither did I." "About you." They stood there in the doorway with the sea behind them and the bar dark behind Chidera, and the whole ugly architecture of what Tayo had built laid out between them like a map neither of them had asked for. Then Tayo came down the stairs. He saw them both, and the face he made, the particular rearrangement of a man caught not in a moment of weakness, but in a system he had designed, told Chidera everything she needed to know about what she'd actually been living inside. She didn't scream. She didn't throw anything. She stepped back from the door, let Flavia in, walked upstairs, packed her one bag, the same one she'd arrived with, which somehow felt important, and sat on the edge of the bed and waited for him to come and explain himself. He came up 20 minutes later. The explanation he gave her was the worst kind, the kind that's mostly true, delivered by a man who has learned that honesty, offered partially and at the right moment, can do more damage control than a full lie. He said he cared for her. He said it had gotten complicated. He said Flavia was from before. He said things that were designed to sound like confession but were actually negotiation. Chidera listened to all of it. Then she said, "Where is my money, Tayo?" Not the salary, not the float account, the money she had been helping him move. "This is where you need to stay with me. Because this is where the story stops being about heartbreak and starts being about who Chidera actually was underneath all that quiet. If you're not subscribed, do it now. Because what happens next, you need to hear all of it." She had noticed it in the 4th month. Patterns in the accounts that didn't match the bar's actual traffic. Cash that came in on nights when the bar was half empty. Suppliers who didn't exist in any registry she could find. International transfers routed through 3 different accounts before landing somewhere clean. She hadn't said anything. She had simply kept her own records. A woman who grew up watching adults hide things learns early that information is the only currency that doesn't devalue. Chidera had 2 notebooks. One that Tayo knew about, the official bar accounts, clean and presented, and one that she kept in the lining of her winter coat, the one she'd never quite thrown away, The one folded at the back of the wardrobe where a man whose guilt makes him incurious would never think to look. In that notebook was everything. Every irregular transfer. Every ghost supplier. Every night the numbers didn't add up, and the explanation Tayo gave her was just vague enough to discourage follow-up. She had written it all down in the small, careful handwriting of a woman who had learned not to trust her memory when the stakes were high. Tayo's bar was not just a bar. It was a door. A very pleasant, well-decorated, good room-having door through which money entered dirty and exited clean. The actual operation was managed by two men she had met only twice. A Ghanaian named Mensa, who came through every other month, and a Brazilian she knew only as Ramos, who never came inside and always waited by the water. She didn't know who they answered to. She didn't need to. What she knew was enough. She gave Tayo one chance. She laid it out simply, sitting across the table from him the morning after the confrontation with Flavia, her notebook open between them like a quiet verdict. "You have two choices," she said. "You pay me what I'm owed, 3 months' real salary, not the reduced version you've been running, plus a settlement for what I now know and what I could do with it. Or I make a call." Tayo looked at the notebook for a long time. Then he looked at her. She had seen many expressions on this man's face. The warm laugh. The Sunday morning ease. The careful blankness he wore when Mensa visited. But she had not seen this one before. Something behind the eyes that was not anger and was not fear, but was the specific calculation of a man deciding whether a problem can still be managed or whether it has already become something else. "You don't know who you're playing with," he said. "I know exactly who I'm playing with," she said. "That's why I'm sitting here talking to you instead of making the call first." He stood up. She didn't move. He walked to the window and looked out at the water for a long time. The sea was flat that morning, silver and still, the way it gets before something shifts. "Give me a week," he said. "You have 3 days," she said. She stood up. She closed the notebook. She left the bar and walked down to the water and stood there until the shaking in her hands stopped, which took longer than she wanted it to. The 3 days passed. No money came. On the 4th morning, she woke to find her bag had been searched. Carefully, almost professionally, but not carefully enough. The lining of her coat had been opened and restitched with a slightly different thread. The notebook was still there. They had photographed it, she realized, rather than taking it, which meant they wanted her to think she still had leverage while they decided what to do about her. That same afternoon, Ramos appeared at the bar for the first time ever coming inside. He sat at the counter and ordered rum and looked at her with the flat patience of a man who handles problems for a living. She poured his drink. She smiled. She said, "Obrigada," when he paid. She walked to the back room, picked up her phone, and made the call she had prepared for 3 weeks. The woman on the other end was named Dora. She was a journalist, Brazilian, sharp, with a particular interest in waterfront money and the foreign nationals who moved through Salvador's nightlife. Chidera had found her through a contact from her London days, a South African photographer who knew everyone worth knowing. She had approached Dora quietly, 2 weeks before the confrontation with Tayo, which tells you something about Chidera's relationship with preparation. She sent Dora the photographs she had taken of her own notebook. Every page, plus 3 bank documents she had copied quietly during her 4th month on the job, when she had still been filing and trusted with the printer. She didn't do this out of rage. She did it out of arithmetic. A man who has you in his home, in his bed, in his books, and then chooses to protect his operation over settling with you, has already made a decision about your value. Chidera had simply made her own decision first and backdated it. It didn't happen the way it does in films. There was no dramatic raid, no handcuffs in the rain, no moment where Tayo looked across a crowded room and understood everything. What happened was slower and more permanent. Dora published nothing immediately. She was a journalist, not a weapon. She needed verification, sources, time. But she made calls. And in the world Tayo operated in, calls from journalists land like stones dropped into still water. The ripple moves outward before anyone even sees where it started. Mensa stopped coming. Ramos stopped coming. The irregular transfers stopped. The bar kept running. Tayo was not arrested. Not immediately, not ever in the clean way that would have satisfied a simpler story, but the door he had built so carefully was quietly bricked up from the outside. The money stopped moving through. And without the money, the bar was just a bar. A bar with expensive rent and thin margins and a sound system that still respected itself, but couldn't pay for its own electricity. Within 2 months, Tayo was negotiating with creditors. Within 4, the bar was sold. Chidera was not there to see any of it. She had left Salvador 3 weeks after the call to Dora. Not running. She had a flight booked, a plan made, a woman from Tayo's life who had quietly become something closer to an ally. Flavia, as it turned out, had her own version of a notebook. Her own carefully held account of what she had seen and been asked to ignore. The two of them had coffee once, before Chidera left. Sat at a place near the water, not Tayo's water, different water, and talked for 2 hours about nothing and everything the way women do when they have survived the same storm by different boats. Flavia asked her where she was going. Chidera said she wasn't sure yet. Maybe London. Maybe Lagos to see her mother. Maybe somewhere else entirely. Somewhere she hadn't been yet, where no one knew her name and the air had a different weight. Flavia nodded. She reached across the table and put her hand over Chidera's for just a moment. Then she took it back, the way you do when you know that some comfort has to stay brief to stay honest. The earring. You want to know about the earring. The night before she left, Chidera went to the water alone. She had done this before, stood at the edge of the bay in the dark and let the city be loud behind her and tried to locate herself inside all of it. But this night was different. This night, she went with intention. She had one gold earring in her left ear. A small thing, not expensive, not inherited, just a piece she'd bought in Brixton Market years ago that she wore every day without thinking about it. The other one she had lost somewhere in Tayo's bar, months ago, never found. She stood at the water. She thought about her grandmother's voice. About Idemili, the river mother who did not beg. About how the women in white moved through the Pelerinho like they were carrying prayers in their bodies. About what her grandmother used to say, that the water remembers everything returned to it and forgets nothing taken from it. She took the remaining earring from her ear. She held it for a moment. Then she threw it into the sea. She didn't say anything. She wasn't sure she believed enough to pray, and she wasn't sure disbelief had served her well enough to trust. So she just stood there, and the water took it, and the night was warm, and the drums were going somewhere behind her, and she felt, not healed. She was not the kind of woman who believed in that kind of clean resolution, but lighter. The specific lightness of a woman who has paid what she owes to the world that held her and is now free to move. She turned and walked back through the city. Behind her, the sea kept going. It had been going long before Tayo, long before Chidera, long before anyone who had ever stood at that edge and made their offering and asked for nothing but the right to leave whole. 3 days later, the day after her flight, the bar's morning cleaner found a gold earring sitting in the brass offering dish on the shelf behind the bar. The dish nobody touched. The one the old women said belonged to Yemanja. The cleaner told Celia. Celia told no one and everyone, the way old women manage information. And when someone eventually told Tayo, he sat down on the floor and did not move for 2 hours. Not because he was superstitious. Because he was a Yoruba man who had named his bar after a goddess and built his fortune in a city that runs on the old power, and somewhere deep in the place where a man keeps the things he refuses to say out loud. He had always known that the water was watching. He had just believed, the way men like him believe, that watching and acting were different things. He had been wrong. Chidera landed in Lagos on a Wednesday morning. Her mother was thinner than the last time. The house smelled like camphor and old wood, and the particular silence of a woman who has been ill long enough to make peace with the walls around her. She looked up when Chidera walked through the door and did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "You look like yourself again." Chidera sat beside her on the bed. She didn't tell her mother about Tayo. She didn't tell her about the notebook or Dora or Flavia or the earring thrown into the bay in the dark. She just sat there, in the house she grew up in, with the woman who had made her, and listened to the sound of a Lagos afternoon. The generators, the hawkers, the distant traffic, the neighborhood living its life without asking permission from anyone. She stayed for 6 weeks. She slept properly for the first time in a year. She did not think about Salvador every day, then every few days, then once a week, then only when it rained hard and the sound of it on the roof reminded her of the drums, and she would lie there in her childhood bed and let it move through her, and then let it go. Idemili does not ask you to carry the river. She only asks that you remember you came from water, and that you do not let anyone convince you that you are dry. If this story found you tonight, if something in Chidera's silence felt familiar, then you already know what it means. Share this with someone who keeps their pain too quiet. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because next week, another woman in another city is about to make a decision that changes everything. And you need to be there when she does.